5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Art of Move podcast with myself, Anthony Manuel, my good friend, Dr. William Raybar. We're out here in the Canadian Rockies trying to find the truth behind human movement and biomechanics. We have a really great episode today, just kind of recapping all the wild conversations that we had this past month. We had some great guests on. We had some cool debates happen. We had some cool topics that we covered. We want to do a little bit of a roundup of some of the standout stuff. We didn't get a chance to really debrief on some of the topics that we got to cover with all of our guests. And we haven't done a solo episode in a while. So, this is the first time Will and I are just here to kind of reflect on some of the great conversations that we had with some great guests. Anything that's been kind of burning in the back of your mind since we've been doing some of the episodes this month?
Well, I'm constantly thinking about it. So there's a ton, right? Like, where should we start? I mean, the WEC episode was insane, right? Like, everybody that watched it was could probably agree with that. There was a lot of good ideas that came out of that, and a lot of straw man, I guess you can say, and a lot of great ideas as well, right?
Yeah,
So
exactly.
maybe we should put that aside for a second and get into the debate with and discussion mostly with Stillness Academy and OKF Fitness. And let's talk about, I guess we can start with where I come from with the Spinal Engine. Okay,
Yeah,
so
and for those who don't know, just before you get into it, if anyone's listening, we had this cool debate, and like you said, it ended up being more of a conversation about whether or not the spine is the primary driver of locomotion. There's a spinal engine theory, which we've covered in multiple episodes. Highly recommend going and listening to that, especially if you are a fan of some of the more technical aspects of biomechanics that we talk about on this podcast. But that was basically, it was like, is the spine the primary driver of locomotion? If not, what is its role in locomotion? We kind of all agreed that the spine moves during locomotion, but you were saying, with your understanding of spinal engine, what is your background?
yeah, so like I think maybe we asked the wrong question. Like we didn't think about the question very well, because it's saying the driver can mean a lot of different things to a lot of people. Driver could mean the thing that originates the movement, the thing that amplifies the movement, right? So we were kind of all over the place with that idea in general. And the way I
Mm.
came about Spinal Engine personally, being somebody who went to school for a long time, learned all the academic end, that was never even touched upon in mainstream academics. It was all brace the core, whether the core should be braced, whether it should be braced out like a lifter, or whether you should bring in your belly button like let's say FP teaches, right? Where to get the
Mm-hmm.
transverse abdominis going, right? And the multifidi in the back. Okay, so that was the original debate that I came upon, and we can unpack that too. But the reason I really liked Spinal Engine when I saw it and when I came upon the idea is that it was actually different from everything I learned. Okay. And that is actually my bias towards it. It is debunking the brace the core model and the still spine, the spine that stays rigid because it is a passive column. So for me, the
Mm-hmm.
primary question was, is the spine a passive column? Because if it's a passive column, that changes how you rehab the spine, that changes how you train movement. It changes a lot of things, and it changes at 360, right? So we were all in agreement that basically we've kind of ditched the brace the core model and went into the spinal engine. The spine moves as you move. Okay, we all agreed on that. Okay, the
Mm-hmm.
question of what originates the movement, now that is where it all fell apart, right? Or what the driver of the movement was. And to be honest, like looking back, I would say that WEC actually had the best idea so far. It's the intent to go forward, okay, as the
Yeah.
driver. Okay, it's the energy that you give to the movement. However, that's not the actual like the spine still moves, okay? So
Yeah.
that
Right.
still happens, but the driver is the intent to go forward. I like that idea the best that I've heard so far. And then we can
Well, if you
unpack it
think
from there.
if you think of the word driver versus the word engine as well, like a driver, I always think of like the person who's in the car, who's moving and operating the vehicle. Like you can have an engine that's rip roaring, but like the driver is still turning and deciding where the car is going, how much gas is on the pedal, and that intention. If you think about, maybe the neurological output of the intention to move forward, that is the quote driver of locomotion. That is kind of what manipulates movement. I think when we're thinking about what is the engine of a biomechanically efficient forward locomotive pattern, I think we weren't very specific, right? Saying what is the driver of forward locomotion, that's it's very non-specific. Maybe a better question would have been, what is the most biomechanically efficient or biomechanically correct way for the human body to move? And if so, what role does the spine, or like what role does the spine have in that biomechanically efficient gait pattern? And
Mm.
is does the spine play a a very prevalent role in how much force is produced to propel yourself forward? Is it a stabilizer? Like what is the actual role of the spine in a biomechanically efficient locomotive pattern? Would have been a better maybe question to bring to that table of debate, because we did end up losing a lot on the semantics of the wording, right? It was like, well, you're thinking the word engine is wrong. Well, I agree with that for the most part. Like, it's not I don't think spinal movement itself is the actual uh, center point of, or originator of, force production for forward locomotion. In fact, I don't think there is one part of the body that is universally responsible for initiating locomotion. I think that's kind of, we had one of our earliest episodes was talking about the limitations of considering body part specific um, functions in the body, when the body is kind of meant to be looked at as an entire kinetic chain that functions as a unified whole, right? So, what is the spine properly supposed to do in a biomechanically efficient gait pattern? I think would have been a better question and a better point of debate. I love the ideas of the counter rotating hips and shoulders that we talked about and the nuances of that. But any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think that like looking back, I think stillness was Caesar was really trying to answer that question. It's like, what is the most efficient way to go forward? Um, so basically, I made the point that locomotion is locomotion. It's movement from one to the other. Can you move, right? And he was like, well, it's not going to be efficient if you look at the. He was basically saying that the guy with no arms and no legs who moves disproves the spinal engine, right?
Mhm.
Where for me, it just shows that, yeah, it's not the primary power to get you forward. And you're going to have to do different series of figure eights and different movements with your hips and your shoulders if you don't have legs versus when you do have legs. You're absolutely more inefficient when you don't have legs. And if I'm going to look at the power source of the body, right, and what drives you forward, it's I'm going to look at the biggest muscles if we're looking at power. Okay, so with regards to power, it's obviously the glutes, and that's the biggest muscle propelling you
Yeah.
forward, right? However, the whole thing's a connection, and the whole thing's a symphony, right? Especially when you're getting more complex with movement. So, and again, we're in agreement. We were just like asking different questions there. He was more, in my opinion, when I looked back, was trying to answer what is most efficient. And he also, I don't think, comes from the same camp as I do, where I was in the academic world and it was absolutely not even a question that you brace the core, right? So
Yeah. Mhm.
for me, the central question up until like 2 years ago was, do I move my spine? Is the spine
Mm.
supposed to move? Or do I actively try to stop it from moving because it's a passive column? Okay. That's different from looking at the spinal engine and going, what is driving most efficiency? Right. So
Mm.
that's really just a small like disagreement there where we're asking what I believe is different questions.
Yeah, and again, because I think that's kind of a lesson for us too, to really consider the specificity in language when we're proposing a question for people to discuss. I think it's really important to kind of have. I know there was also a little bit of a disagreement about this idea of balance between you and Derek of One of a Kind Fitness, in terms of, should your head be over your foot, specifically in a downhill context. And I've actually, I spent like at least half an hour yesterday going up and down the stairs and filming myself in slow motion, trying to find, what do I naturally do when I don't think about going down the stairs after doing a lot of gait patterning work. I tried to play with a bunch of different gait patterning things that felt most efficient. And I was like bombing up and down like two or three steps at a time, or going as fast as I can down each step. And I actually had a conversation with David Weck over the phone yesterday about what he does, and we talked about, like if you're trying to go maximum speed and maximum safety, is your head over your foot? What's the gait pattern for a downhill? Like if you're bombing down a hill as safely as you can, and he kind of talked about coming at it from an angle. So like your feet are coming at it like 45 degrees, you're bombing down, you're almost using a same side stride is what he would call it. And I thought about it. It's like, oh, well, like, when I'm kind of like trying to control myself and stop myself from skidding down a hill when I'm doing a hike, when I'm climbing down the mountain, I have a tendency to come at it from that angle, either from, like I'll like lead with my left foot or my right foot. And I'm doing a lot of that same side stride to control myself from just falling down. And I can go pretty fast too. I can control myself a little bit better if I'm doing that same side stride. But I wanted to talk to you about this idea of balance and head over foot. Do you remember the exact disagreement that you guys had?
Yeah, like just to unpack what you said a little bit there with the same side stride, I was under the impression that Weck's same side stride is when you stride with both hands on one side of your body. I wouldn't exactly do that to go downhill. However, I would love to hear Weck's idea about that, right? And like when I'm hiking and I'm going really steep, that is when I'm going 45 degrees, right? Or I shouldn't say 45 degrees. My foot won't be over my head. And that's really what we unpacked there. Okay. And OKF was right about that in terms of if I'm going faster, okay, if I'm having to cut, my head doesn't go over my foot. Okay. Now you're introducing a new force vector. I was more speaking if I'm walking or running normally, which is, you're doing straight ahead. Okay. Which most people are doing the majority of the time. Once you add lateral force in there, then it becomes a whole different game. Right. And that game really is matching force vectors. So an easy example, again, is the skiing examples, right? Where I'm cutting really hard. If you ever watch a skier and the G-forces are really high, right? Like I've measured my G-forces skiing, and it's much higher than like a Porsche Carrera on a Nuremberg track cornering, okay? So you have really high force there. So my feet, my ski has to be way out. My edge has to be way up high. And I have to be pushing a lot of power into the ground. Now, what's actually happening there is my head's not over my foot. My foot is way outside my base. However, if my ski is to slide off there, I'm going to go for a huge slam. I have no next move. And that's a missing element in balance to me. You have to have a next move, and then you're the most balanced. And your subconscious is going to let go a little bit when it knows it's safe on the next move. If I watch a boxer, for instance, and they're new and they do one maneuver, they know how to do, like, let's say a 1-2, a jab right hand, but then their brain gets scrambled afterwards, or maybe they get hit in between and then they lose their balance. And then it becomes easy to take them off balance because they didn't have a next move. Where a seasoned boxer will always know it's like, okay, my last move is a roll out. And as long as my head travels towards my foot, okay, I know that I'm in balance as soon as I hit the point of my foot, meaning I have a next move. But I can also be quote unquote balanced if I stick my foot way out and push like let's say a running back avoiding a tackle. Right. But again, I only have that one maneuver to do. As soon as I commit, I have to really lunge towards one side. Even the person that's trying to tackle me will know as soon as I plant and my body's leaning one direction, I know I have to go that way. Unless you do like, and again, I'm talking maybe the mid-level here because I'm sure you can show an example of Barry Sanders doing some wild maneuver to cut himself the other way, right? But let's go in order of priority. Walking and jogging and running in a straight line, head over foot. As soon as you start going laterally, head over foot becomes smart to make a next move, but not necessary to quote unquote balance, not fall down. Okay. So it really is about, to me, good balance is a continuous thing where I can continuously go. I want to balance, if I can, continuously and have the movement options available to me. So again, boxing is a great example here. If I'm moving my head towards my foot and my head's in motion, and as soon as my head reaches my foot, I have the option of moving my front foot. I have the option of putting my body weight down a little bit, letting go of my body weight and skipping forward. And then my back foot becomes the foot that's under my head. I have the option of pushing power out of my hands, right? So it really like gives you much more option to have your head over your foot. But you don't have to if you want to commit to a lateral force. Okay.
Mm.
But that's more dangerous. You don't have a next move, or you only have one option for the next move.
I think the key term there is committing to a lateral force. It's like knowing that if you miss that, you're scrambled, right? So balance, instead of, people think when like the word balance kind of rolls out in terms of a training or a fitness capacity, they think of, like static balance, like you're balancing on one foot, or maybe you're walking a tightrope, or, it's this idea that you can have a stable next move into another point where you're still in control. And balance in the context of movement is very different than just static balance, right? It's not just, how well can you like stand on your hands without eating shit. It's not, how well can you walk on a tightrope and not fall off. This is like, if you're running, you're cutting, you're boxing, you're in rhythm, and within that rhythm you can flow fluidly from one position to the next without getting your center of gravity swept out from under you. And I love that idea. Like for me, that was a big aha moment when you shared this idea of having a next option for where you're going to move to from the current center of gravity that you're in, because your center of gravity is always changing when you're in motion. Even if you think about like a very straightforward locomotive thing, we've talked about the head over foot being the passing of this energy from side to side, from this like column of centered gravity side to side. But when you're actually moving in three dimensions, and you're locomoting in three dimensions, it's the ability to either pivot or be in a place where you're still in control of your center of gravity. And if someone even knocks you off kilter a little bit, even though you're in motion, you'll be able to get to your next position in a secure way. That was like sort of my takeaway from that.
Yeah, and the cue for me, if possible, is literally we'll call it the green dot, we'll call it what Goda calls it, the outside edge. Okay. Either one. Let's pretend there's a laser coming up from that area. Okay, the outside of my foot. As soon as my head touches that laser, even if it's accelerating, there's a millisecond and it's in the area there, right? It's not just that one spot, it's the area there. Okay. As soon as my head hovers over that spot, even if it's accelerating, I have a movement option. And it may just be a millisecond. If I'm accelerating faster, that means that it's a more complex movement. I have to time it better. And that's the key. It's timing, right? And another thing is like I see balance and posture being very similar in that whenever, people in the public and even, anatomists and clinicians, when they talk about posture, it's usually a static standing posture. Almost everybody thinks that. It's like, what is your posture? It's like, okay, tall chest and it's the average good posture of what everybody thinks. But really, posture to me is dynamic. Can you move and maintain good integrity of your body? Let it synchronize together. To me, that's posture. And it's very much analogous to the balance, right? Where everybody thinks balance is you standing on one foot or standing on a Bosu ball or standing on one of those like what are they called? Balance boards of any kind. That is balance. If you can do that, right? So that kind of leads into a little bit more nuance of center of gravity itself, okay? Or like the concept of center of gravity. And how I've seen it kind of defined, and maybe I'm wrong here, and I don't think I am, but it's basically your center of mass over your base of support, okay? And the base of support is your 2 feet. And again, we're coming back to the static balance, okay? That's how it's been defined in academia, from what I've seen anyway, right? Again, there's no head over foot in academia. So how can you have anything that's not traveling forward? Or sorry, how can you have a one-footed balance in a travel, like as you're moving in that model? Your head stays in the middle, right? So
well, and that's what the example that David Weck brought up, when you get a person who's standing on 2 feet with the head right in the center, and they lift the one leg up and they fall off to the side, and their diagnosis was that their QL was underdeveloped. I do know that like standing on one foot, even if your head is in your column, you still need to develop a certain degree of foot strength to maintain your relationship, like basically the center of mass is still being manipulated by that one smaller point. So there is some muscular develop, some neurological development in terms of static balance and slow moving balance to maintain, like the smaller the point that you're trying to maintain, then more neurologically demanding it is. If you're trying to like go slow and you're trying to resist these like alternating forces, there is that skill of balance in that context, but the context is generally pretty limited, I find.
Well, yeah, what you're saying is correct, right? Like the center of balance, or sorry, the center of mass being between the base of support, again, is you standing your head between your feet as you're standing there. You are balanced because both your feet are on the ground, right? However, actually, what you just did there, so if anyone's listening, Anthony's just lifting up one leg and trying to keep his center, right? Notice what you're doing with your hip. Your hip's flaring out laterally, right?
Yeah.
So in
And
order
then
for
if
you,
I just
yeah.
go head over foot, it's just like way easier.
Exactly, right? Because it's just balance. It's the balance point. This is nowhere to be found in academics because then they would have to admit the side bend. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
again, you're not between your base of support. And if you are between your base of support, which doesn't exist anymore because you're on one foot, your hip has to come out or you have to do something awkward in order to be able to maintain that upright stance, right? So yeah, your hip is laterally shifting out, and that is what usually happens to people is when they're not balanced and they don't have the cue of head over foot, or let's say they've been bracing too hard for too long, your hip will shift out laterally to help you out. Okay. So then you can't set up a good spinal, quote unquote, spinal engine because your hip's way out laterally. And I think One of a Kind Fitness touched on this. I don't think in this context, but he did touch on, look, you can't have the spinal engine if your hip is laterally shifted first. So we have to get the lumbo-pelvic hip complex to act accordingly before we worry about that, right? So
Right.
I think he was
So
spot
his
on
whole
there.
thing is stabilizing the lumbopelvic hip complex, but what you just described of like, that's a an unconscious compensation that's just happened, that hip shift that just happened with me when I was just, lifting the leg up and trying to keep my head in the center between my two legs. My hip shifts as a result of that. Do you think that training your core to be super stiff and rigid and not have that lateral bend, could that cause a lot of hip shifting, and like, even though you might have a very stable core, it could destabilize your lumbopelvic hip complex?
I hypothesize that yes. And like you're doing it, you just showed that you do it standing, right? The question really is, does that transfer to locomotion? Would the hip also shift if you don't have that proper in your column or head over foot as you're, and we're talking just walking now, walking in a straight line?
Mhm.
Would your hip also shift? Even if it's a slight degree, right? Would it shift if your head is not balanced over your foot? And I would say it most likely would. And I see it quite a bit. And you can test it by just, watching somebody lift their foot like you did, right? So again,
Yeah.
like the
Yeah.
center of mass no longer is between the base of support because your base of support changed as you walked. Okay.
Mhm.
So the academic is 2 feet on the ground, but that doesn't happen as you walk. So where's the model, right? Where's the model for 1 foot at a time? Like David Weck was saying, the gate guys who I subscribed to for a long time, these are the like leading academic guys in the field. I'd pay $50 a month to watch their one webinar a month because it was like, in my mind, it was so gold. And now I look at it like, what was I thinking, right? But it's the leading academic. They do all the research and train your big toe, train your they go very intricate, right? It's like your extensor hallucis or your extensor digitorum is too short, therefore you can't balance. It's like um, you just have to go head over foot and then you're balanced. Uh, it's not the extensor hallucis longus. It's like maybe it is now, but was that the cause of it? Or is it because you're not balanced over a million steps and your tissues have to tighten up for you to continue, right? Like, I don't know, but I would
Well, and
hypothesize that.
this was our discussion about like, what does stabilization of a joint necessarily mean, especially in the context of being in motion. If you're talking about stabilizing your lumbopelvic hip complex, well, do you need to do specific like stabilization drills of that area of your body in isolation in order for it to biomechanically work? Or like, what could you, could you put your head in your columns properly? Could you put your head over your foot in gait, and then technically you wouldn't have that hip compensation as much? Would that correct that over time? And this has been, like, obviously this has been a recurring theme in our podcast discussions. We're talking about the isolation of joints and tissues versus correcting the biomechanical patterns so that the joints can behave in the way that they're supposed to behave, which should, in theory, resolve a lot of problems, right? So it's like, to how much stabilization, like, to me, that compensation just result, like, the more that we've had these discussions and the more into biomechanics that I've started to dive into, the more that I kind of noticed how overemphasizing training certain body parts to be stable or secure limits the mobility and the functionality of how fluid they're able to move in synchronicity with one another. And the result of that is global compensations at other joint junctions. So, the example of, like, do you need to stabilize the lumbopelvic hip complex, or do you need to just stop doing so much core work, mobilize the spine, and then start focusing on landing your head over your foot? Because then you won't be leaning your hip out to the side. Like, what are your thoughts?
Well, that's a great question, actually. And okay, so your body neurologically and mechanically, but let's talk neurological right now. If you've done a million steps and your hip shifts out laterally because you're not balanced up top, then you've wired that in neurologically. Okay, it's said principle there. Now the question is, how do we train it back? Like, can you take the hip complex, for instance, in this exact scenario where your hip is shifting out? Can you take the hip complex and with an isolated exercise, bring it back to quote unquote stability? And in fact, this is everybody's go-to. Glute med, monster walks, band walks, fire hydrants. Those are all isolated, thinking that your glute med is the important muscle to stop your your hip from shifting laterally. Okay. Now, is this the case? Is it broad stroke that if, like, let's say my core is so rigid and I can't let my spine bend to where it wants to bend over my foot to catch a balance point, and my hip shifts out accordingly, is it my glute med being weak? Is it my glutes being weak? If I'm front chain dominant, if my hips go forward, okay, and my ribs are way back, is it my, and I don't have that spinal motion with my head over my foot or even close to, and my hip shifts out laterally again, is it the fact that I'm unstable, or is it the fact that I'm in the front chain of my musculature and I can't access any of that? Okay, so for me, like, the science is incorrect on this one, or where they're looking, and that's key too. They're looking for glute med because glute med is already the answer to the problem. Okay, so we already know, they would say, we already know that glute med is the issue. We just need to know how to train it better. And you've just haven't done enough monster walks. But let's not even talk about the spinal engine. In fact, the other day I saw a post by IKN. This is integrated in neuromuscular. Like, I can't remember exactly what it is, but it's IKN on Instagram. And I pointed out because he was talking about the curves of the spine. And again, only the sagittal plane, right? And he's like, we need to exaggerate, like, we don't need to straighten out the spine. We need to make the curves act more elastic. And it's like, but you're not talking about, like, anything to do with side bend. You're only talking straight back and forth. And I asked him a question. I'm like, have you heard of the concept of the spinal engine? He's like, yeah, we've heard of it. And I'm like, okay, do you teach it? Because I only see you doing sagittal plane right now. And you're, like, purposely not talking about the side to side, right? And there was no answer to be had. I tried like 3 different times. And it seems to me like the industry really doesn't want to recognize the side bend. There's starting to be a trend towards, yes, the spine is mobile. Again, those, what are they called? Jefferson curls, or the acknowledgement that the spine is supposed to bend in the sagittal plane, but you won't find the admittance of the spine bending side to side, which is allowing head over foot, which doesn't allow the hip shift. That's nowhere to be found. And I think it's a little bit disingenuous to really ignore it. Okay. Because the acknowledgement, I was like, at first I was like, oh, this is great. Everyone's acknowledging that the spine moves. But again, it's like the side bend is nowhere to be found. Now, Weck did say that he told knees over toes guy about it.
Yeah.
And they've practiced it. So I'm looking forward to seeing that from knees over toes guy. And I'll keep an eye out and see an update. I'll watch his new stuff to see if he integrates it.
And so it was integrated kinetic neurology. That's based on the same sort of academic model of kinesiology that you were taught, in anatomy that you were taught in school. One of the issues, like you said, with the parts approach, right? And it's funny because I was kind of exposed to this idea of, if your background is in training, you're still looking at body part specific things. You're still looking at tissue conditioning above anything else. The front chain versus back chain one, I find, is the most interesting. Even in our course that we just released, there was a section that one of our students screenshotted and sent to me and said, "Wow, this one was like the aha moment for me," where it seems that every physio and their dog is prescribing clamshells with a pink band because of underactive glutes, when in reality people are stuck in their front chain. Their hips are in front of their rib cage, and all they can activate are their quads, their hip flexors, the front side of their abdomen. And if they were posterior chain dominant, back chain dominant, they had their hips behind their ribs, then the continual resistance of the force of gravity just from existing, just from standing, would activate their glutes, would teach their glutes to fire in the proper way, would teach their whole backside to fire in the proper way, and their structure would be more supported. They wouldn't have any issues with firing their glutes. And so looking at it as a part specific thing, maybe you put this a cathode to kind of measure the nerve output or the contractile force of a particular muscle. It's like, okay, well, that's fine and dandy. But a lot of the biomechanical approach to training, or correcting biomechanics in training, is not learning specifically to actively fire a muscle through consciously flexing it like you would in bodybuilding or even powerlifting for that matter. You're not consciously trying to contract. You're specifically trying to stack your joints in the proper way and learn how your body's biomechanically supposed to move, so that your muscles fire in the correct sequence, that your muscles fire in the correct way to support your structure. And that's the big differentiating factor, right? So to them, they're still thinking in terms of a parts approach. And I think that's, maybe a symptom of looking at the body anatomically to reverse engineer movement principles by looking at it in parts, make you think of the body as a collection of parts, and fail to consider the body moving as an integrated unit. Some people do. We talked about how some people will, but like, consider up and down the chain. But even when we were talking before about the physiotherapist or the conventional chiropractic approach, is you look at the muscle or the chain above and below that area that is injured or in pain, because that's the closest thing to the chain. They won't look at the whole system necessarily,
because they don't really know it, right? Like,
yeah.
It's the truth, right? Like, I was really interested in this in school, and the best guys coming up were Stu McGill, Gray Cook, Craig Liebenson. These guys were like pioneers, and everybody was like, if he'd come to school and do a talk, there'd be hundreds of people there watching him, and he's teaching the brace the core model and muscle isolation, right? Because they come from a lifting paradigm, and they do their studies with a lot of them. Like, I'll take, for instance, a specific study where they bend the spine, and they're like, it takes 10,000 cycles to make I can't remember if it was a joint or a disc, delaminate, basically unravel the disc. Okay, we'll say that. It was a Stu McGill research. And the point to that was, it's cadaver. It's not real life tissue. There's nothing in there. They took a pig cadaver, wrenched it a couple times, and then it broke. And then that is extrapolated to what we should believe inside the vivo human body. And that's where Weck was like, don't poo-poo. I think those are the exact words, cadaver science. But to me, it's not poo-pooing it. It's like, the language is obviously all what we learned and what everybody has to use, because that's all that's there. Nobody knows anything else. Where Goda comes in and puts in a completely new language, and everyone's getting upset, right? And like, not everybody understands the language, but I think there does need to be a change, because you fundamentally can't describe multi-dimensional movement with the current cadaver language. So yeah, Da Vinci and like Michelangelo, they had to use dead bodies and figure it out using like literal cadavers. And that's how I figured it out in school, because that's all what was presented, right? We had 2 years specifically multiple times per week with a cadaver, which we dissected from head to toe, right? So I've seen every single part in there, and it does not act the same way on the table, obviously, than it does in real life. So the descriptions must be different. That doesn't mean to completely throw out cadaver science, but it may mean to throw out a lot of the language or replace a lot of the language when we're talking in motion. Okay. So, yeah, that's just kind of what I had to say about that one.
Yeah.
Any
Do
thoughts
you
on
think
that?
that there are? Yeah, I was going to ask because I do find there is some utility in looking at the structures after you've kind of considered, like for me, I did spend a lot of time looking at anatomy and looking at structures and looking at different lever lengths in the lifting context, because I was very, very obsessed with lifting and muscular hypertrophy for a long time. But kind of what I wish I would have done, like if I could have gone back, I could like erase my brain but still go in with like a learning plan, is I would observe the movements first and then look at the structures to kind of get a context for understand. Like I would go in looking for how the structures support the movements that I was already observing. But I think there is utility in looking at the anatomical structures, looking at fascial lines, looking at even organ placement. Do you think that there is a place for studying and observing cadaver science, quote unquote, or do you think you should mostly just focus on movement?
Um, yeah, like that one's a tough one, right? For a like a clinician or like a chiropractor or physio, obviously you should look at the anatomy as well, right? Like I need
Mm,
to know where the nerves are coursing through. I need to know the physical locations of places, but that's not the way it moves. Okay. So for instance, in university and Cairo school, we're talking like 1,000 hours, if not more, probably way more than that, of anatomy. And this
mm,
is over and over again. This is just memorizing where everything courses through, but never talking about how it actually symphonizes or like comes together in a symphony. Never talking about multiple joints happening at moving at once and the specifics of how they're moving. In biomechanics, it was like there was a lot of math and there was a lot of acknowledgement of force vectors. So like you'd have a diagram with arrows pointing in every direction with like math around it. And like, they would say things like centripetal force. Like if I'm going to do a spin, I go from wide to narrow and that increases the force, right? Because once you get off the ground, it's the same force that's going to be in your body, but you can manipulate your body to increase the speed of, let's say, a spin if you go from wide to narrow.
mm,
Okay. So there was those acknowledgments, but there wasn't an acknowledgement of the parts working in symphony and exactly how they're moving, like a Agoda does, like Weck's doing, like I think Functional Patterns does it a little bit, and like let's say a PRI is starting in that camp a little bit. They're talking about how the pelvis moves and how it rotates. That's already starting to move into the realm that goes beyond the anatomy, the cadaver anatomy. But it's, in order to assess movement, you need a different language. That's a bottom line for me. And
mm,
I think Goda is doing a very good job of simplifying it. A lot of people don't like it, right? Like they'll take the one example, the Goda versus WODA, and they'll be like, if like well, I went on woke movement coaches today because Weck mentioned it. He's like, I got my info from about Goda from woke movement coaches. So I went on the page today to check it out, and I'm like, this is just completely all straw man. If
mm,
this is where he's getting his info, then like it's a problem, right? Because they don't actually have good information on there. They're just picking things out and straw manning it, like the arguments that aren't really there. So going back to WODA versus Goda, and this may be the fault of Goda too, right? An example would be the woke movement coaches put up a video of like Coach Gill running, and his heel was turning inside, and they're
mm,
like, "Look, your top guy can't even heel away all day. So how is anyone else supposed to do it?" It's like they're not saying that once you start training Goda in the first month, then you're just going to be goat all the time. Your heel's going to go away. Your inside ankle bone is going to be high every time. No, it's a process, right? Like even if you're awesome at inside ankle bone high, in standing, you might not be walking, or your ankles might drop walking, but they might be, they might be down walking and you might be able to pick them up standing, or vice versa. Or for some weird reason, your ankle bones come up high as you start running, and then as you start jogging, they'll go low, right? So that stuff also happens. So it's not a clear cut WOTA versus GOTA. There's a spectrum there. And the recognition of the spectrum is very important, because otherwise there's way too much room for straw man.
And that's, maybe, when we interviewed Eric Tessie, that was kind of what we acknowledged. It's like, look, here are these behaviors, and then you have 2 points on a spectrum. And obviously there's this idea of a polarity, right? But if you think about even like hot and cold, right? It's not either, so cold that it freezes your flesh, or so hot that it melts it off the bone. There's a spectrum that exists on it. And I think WOTA and GOTA is just the same sort of idea as saying hot and cold, right? It's this idea that there are better and worse behaviors, and saying WOTA just is demonstrating that, like, okay, look, if you're doing these things and you're on the scale on WOTA, then you're more likely to snap an Achilles or get an ACL tear, because you're in biomechanically insecure patterns. And this idea of like having a polarity is useful, because it talks in terms of black and white. It simplifies things for people, but then also acknowledging that there's nuance. Like people say that there are BOTA athletes because they have both of all-time actions. They exhibit really secure pattern. Maybe they're back chain dominant and they have their heel away, but they have a little bit of an ankle bone drop. And so they're not as secure as they could be, but they're still high on the spectrum of those biomechanically secure and efficient patterns, right? So looking at it as a spectrum, like I used to be of the mindset that if you are a coach, you have an idea, you're talking about like a biomechanical principle or a fitness principle, you need to be the embodiment of that yourself. And actually, Nadia Aguilar messaged me the other day, because I made a post and I talked about, he was the first guy that I saw talking about, you shouldn't do deadlifts, you shouldn't be squatting. And he was the first person to kind of talk about gait. And he had this really good debate with Brett Contreras, where he was, I don't know if you haven't seen it, you should.
I've seen it.
Yeah. And so I made this story, and he messaged me. He's like, look, I was the first one to do it, but it's not about who was talking about gait and stuff first. Every one of these dudes that are teaching gait either has man boobs or a gut. And so for him, it's like, hey, it doesn't matter what ideas they're talking about. These guys look like they're, fat slobs, and they're not good examples of functionality, and they're not embodying the things that they talk about. I used to have that same mentality. But at the same time, it's like, man, like someone's ability to observe something on tape, and like there are people who are fat slobs that are scientific geniuses, right? There are people who are, like you can have an intellectual or a conceptual brilliance to you and not necessarily physically embody everything yourself, right? Like you can understand chemistry without being able to like endogenously produce the chemicals,
Yeah, that's a great point, right? Like, I think we all come from that camp, though. Anybody who's lifted, who's done aesthetics in the past, like bodybuilding, you are looking at other guys and you're like, what does his body look like? Or like, where's the symmetry? And you're looking at them. If they're talking about bodybuilding, especially like the bro culture in the gym, like when you're in the gym, you're looking for the biggest guy. It's like, whoa, that guy's huge. Like, I wonder what he's doing, right? And taking that mentality into like, a GOTA or a WEC method or like something like that, where it's functional. How do I say this? Like, I went on again, I don't know if it was woke movement coaches, but I saw an argument where they're like, one of the GOTA coaches or someone like that anyway was saying, you don't even use slow motion. You don't observe, you don't practice movement yourself. And the guy's like, what do you look like? What is like, let me see what your physique looks like. It's like, what does that have to do with movement? It has nothing to do with movement, but we always go, or have been programmed to go there, right? So if you see, and to be honest, I'm going to be dead honest. When I first saw Gil of Goda, I was like, this guy does not look like he's in shape, right? So I kind of dismissed it a little bit right off the get-go, even though pretty much as soon as I saw the Go to Joe post with the kid or with the baby moving, I was like, okay, there's something to this, right? Like that's actually what first got me as well. And then I went immediately to the book. But either way, I saw the aesthetic and I'm like, that's not what I want. But it didn't take me long to kind of move out of that mentality once I looked into the info. But if you're not of the mindset already to do that, you're going to look at the aesthetics and be like, these guys don't have any good info because the founder isn't a NFL looking.
He's not ripped.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So, yeah, that's really what I have to say about that. And I think it's a huge mistake in the industry, right? I think that there's so much straw man with Goda. It's hard to keep up with. Almost everybody I see that like really makes fun of Goda doesn't understand the Goda principles. They're working off their own principles and trying to disprove Goda using the old linear, or I should say current linear cadaver models, right? So, yeah, that one's hard to deal with for sure.
It's tough. Well, and like you said, we all come from that mentality, including myself. That was I had the same sort of judgment. It's like, okay, well, if this is so great, then why don't you even look healthy, right? And I think there is something to be said for like my mentality on this is walking the walk is important, not just for the credibility physically, but there's something about being really invested in the practice that you're preaching that allows you to teach it with more depth. And I remember for me, it's like when I started coaching CrossFit at CrossFit Banff, I was still doing strength and conditioning work specifically. I was still doing like, powerlifting, bodybuilding, gymnastics, hybrid stuff. And it wasn't quite CrossFit. I'm like, I could probably coach CrossFit because it's CrossFit enough, but it wasn't CrossFit. And I remember thinking, it's like, I'm getting people who are asking me for programming advice, and I don't have the actual physical experience of being in these Metcons. I don't know what the mental side of it's like. So I signed up for a CrossFit competition, despite never having even done like CrossFit WODs. And I started training like a CrossFit athlete, just to have the experience of what it was like. And so that I could program and offer mobility prescriptions with more insights and basically help these people who are trusting me with their bodies to be able to get better results from their programming and make sure that they're staying injury free for a long time. And that was the best thing I could have done in the context. I ended up really enjoying CrossFit in a lot of ways. I never thought I would. I always thought I hated it. I thought CrossFit was kind of dumb, and then I got into it. I was like, this is fucking super fun. I ended up needing shoulder surgery because of it, but like, that's beside the point. It was super fun. And the point of this story is specifically being in the practice and having some skin in the game and caring a lot about your own results and trying to think about the problem solving of your own results as someone who is in the practice gives you so much more insight as a coach, as someone who is advocating for these practices.
I always harp on this. Like, when I'm debating, a physiotherapist online or like a scientific thinker who says research is the truth, right? Basically, that's what they're saying. They're saying the research, the consensus of the peer review study is the truth here. And I'm like, do you have your own movement practice? Do you have any before afters? To them, that's ridiculous. Like, I don't need that. I have the peer review. Okay. So, there's a mentality that goes with this, that if you do believe that the peer review is the truth, then you don't need your own practice.
No.
But if you do believe that you need nuance and you need to be able to practice it yourself to really understand it, and that may include going against the peer review, which I have multiple times. I don't always go against it, but if I'm in my body, because I have a deep movement practice, if it doesn't work, I'm throwing it out. And there's a lot of scientific peer-reviewed study that doesn't even get in the paradigm. They don't even understand the paradigm. The methods that they use to design the studies is the flaw itself. Okay. And I harp on this so much. We're like, they always talk about conclusions. Okay. They're like, the conclusion says this. It's like, okay, well, how did you get to that conclusion? What was the design of your study? Oh, okay. The design of the study doesn't have anything to do with what we're talking about. It doesn't even understand what we're talking about. It hasn't even tried to understand what we're talking about, but it draws the conclusion that it's wrong. Like, it just doesn't work for me. To me now, I will trust you a lot more if you actually have a movement practice, you've done it yourself, and you can show me. You can show me what you're doing, or you can show it on somebody else. The method right now is like let's say a Joel Seedman, okay? What he's doing is he goes with the peer review. He can find peer review that says 90 degrees is the best way to go. And since he works inside of a gym with a lot of NFL athletes around, they're in the vicinity. They're like, okay, we need the best information possible because I'm the highest athlete. Where do I go? I go to a PhD because he obviously has the best information, right? So you go to the PhD, you get trained, or the research-based training, you go get trained, but they don't show before or after. They don't show the exact what actually happened to the joints or how the joints are moving. They say this NFL athlete is in the NFL and I train them, therefore I know what I'm doing. And I use the peer review. So there we go. I'm the best trainer, right? Where they'll like that type will dismiss the actual practice behind it, the value of having your own practice, right? If I want to learn a front flip, I'll probably go to somebody who can do a double front flip on command versus somebody who's researched front flips, right?
Yeah.
This is movement specific. I'm talking movement here, right? Like, I have to trust you know what you're doing. And let's go back to Goda. When I looked into their work and the founder's work, I was like, oh, actually, he was very injured in the past. And he has structural problems, right? So you can't go back. Like, if you have a structural problem, it's very hard for you to be an athlete. You know what I mean? Like,
totally.
I have a metal in my ankle and no ligaments. So it's like, or very few ligaments. So if I step on someone's foot, I'm screwed, right? So I really have to be careful there. I'm not going to be an athlete anymore, but I can move. So my point really is, it's like, for movement itself, I trust movement practitioners to teach me and to know the nuances versus the peer review.
And I think, that's not to say that peer review has like no credence or application at all, but like, most people aren't actually scientifically literate enough to interpret the study design and to draw their own conclusions from the study. Well, again, there's peer review for a reason, but when you think about peers, it's usually people who are coming in the same academic background who are validating your ideas because you all came up with the same ideas. You were all taught the same concepts. Having someone who maybe isn't a peer who's questioning it might even have more value. And so science is a tricky thing because it implies this sort of like elitist knowledge where only people who are scientifically educated can interpret these studies and can say what studies are good and what studies are bad. And that intellectual elite is usually the people who are, taught university grade academic style information. I guess that's why David Weck referred to them as the intelligentsia that have this conspiracy against, progressive theories on movement that disagree with the typical mainstream academic understanding of different biomechanical principles, right? And that's why some progress that's being made by the Godas, by the Weck methods, by even the functional patterns. I think that that there is one commonality between Goda, Weck, and functional patterns is that they all have issues with physiotherapists and academically trained therapists who say, well, there's no science to back up what you're saying. And it's like, well, we don't need science. Look at the results. And that's the really big thing. It's like we have so much skin in the game. We've been doing this for years. And we've seen the results. We're seeing this with our own eyes. We're practicing it. We're feeling it. This is like, you're going to tell me that you have a peer-reviewed study that disproves or dismantles my lived reality?
Well, I think they would say, like, yeah, it does, because peer review, it's the truth. How could you not think it's the truth? Like, you don't have a way to prove it, because I could just say this is what, a scientific person would think, because I was there, right? Like, let me tell you a little story. When I'm in school, okay, everybody is harping on the peer review. You have to have a justification for what you're doing. And again, I'm in chiropractic, right? So I think there's a little overcompensation there where, you know, society may view like a certain segment of chiropractors as quote unquote quacks, where I'm going to overcompensate by being way in the scientific corner, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you were looked at like by your peers as a good chiropractor or a good student if you use peer review. Okay. So that already brings you into an in group. Now, for me to break away from this after I finished school is difficult because I was part of the research alliance. You know what I mean? I'm part of like groups that all coalesce to say the peer review is the correct truth, right? And the best information, and you're a responsible person if you use it. However, when I start to play with it in real life, and not play with it, but like use it in practice, and I come up to a wall and what I know doesn't work, I think it's a responsibility for me to really look beyond that to find out what does work. And again, like if I'm going to rehab a hip, right now the best thing is to monster walk, to clamshell, to isolate the glute med so that the hip doesn't laterally deviate. It's like, you really think the glute med itself is going to stop a lateral deviation with all the ground reaction forces, gravity, you know, like so many forces going through your body, this one muscle is going to stop that? They'll be like, yeah, the peer review says it. For sure it does. You know, like, so I personally came up to a wall where things that I learned didn't work and the best knowledge didn't help out. So I had to go further, and lo and behold, I'm coming to a place where I'm like, okay, you need to, in movement, you actually need your own practice. You need to understand this. And if I can see you doing something that is, you know, biomechanically, from what I know, looks really good, looks really clean, you've organized your body, and you can pull it off over and over and over again, I'm going to trust you before a peer review. Like I want to hear what you have to say, right? In the least. Okay. So, I mean, that's kind of where I'm at with that right now.
Yeah. Well, and likewise, right? So this is, I think how we started on this point was this idea that a person should have some skin in the game, and the whole idea of like, you know, what does this person look like to prove the efficacy of their theories and their ideas. This is the whole, you know, it's pretty shallow and aesthetically driven culture that we live in, where it's like, you don't look good or you don't look healthy, you don't look vibrant. There's some credence to that. I do think that there's some
For
credence
sure.
to that, but the real, you know, I do agree, the real value in someone having the physical proof that they embody their idea is probably the fact that they're just incredibly committed to their movement practice and their practice of feeling better in their bodies. Especially if you're in the business of helping people feel better in their bodies, you should feel awesome in your body, and you should look like you're healthy and like you feel, you know, like you said, Gil, the founder of Goda, he's not an example of like a light athletic dude. He's a bigger dude, but he has a ton of athletic problems. You know, he's a ton of physical problems, and he developed Goda. You know, and studied all of this stuff. He worked with David Weck. He worked with Kelly Starrett. He worked with all these people to try and develop this system, and he observed these movements because he wanted to fix his own problems, and he did fix his own problems. That was, you know, I think that's the really big thing. It's like, you know, you're not just looking at the physicality of the person. You're not just looking at their bodies and how aesthetically pleasing they are. You're looking at the results of, you know, did they accomplish what they set out to do? In the case of Gil, he set out to fix his problems with pain, and he did. You know, Goda fixed his pain. So I think there's something to be said for that, right?
Um, Absolutely, there is. I think there's everything to be said about that. Really, like, I can't remember who it was, but there was a debate I had, and I was like, anyway, it got to the point where the guy was like, PhDs, like, so someone who has their PhD in, you know, biomechanics or something like that, they obviously know a lot, right? Like, I'm not saying they know like everything they're saying is wrong, right? But when it comes down to it, when it comes down to teaching movement, when it comes down to the symphony of the parts, they don't know it. Like, I'm sorry, they just don't know it. Like, you'll get 90-degree training, you'll get clamshells, you'll get you know, banded ISO monster walks. This is the pinnacle of what you see. And basically the debate I had was like, a PhD goes to school for 10 years, so they know movement. It's like, Okay, like if you're a fighter pilot and you've only read the manual but never flew the plane,
Mm.
I'm not going to trust you with the plane. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
yeah,
Like you
exactly.
might have a lot of knowledge. Like I'll pick your brain on like the mechanics of the engine and like what you know, and you probably know quite a bit. But to actually fly the plane, if you've never done it or you don't even know the how to fly in combat, let's say, and it's a combat situation or you have to like do some maneuver, I'm not going to trust you. You know, like I'm not going to trust you to the fullest.
I think this is the,
Versus,
I've always used the analogy. I've used the analogy that the map isn't the territory, and ideas about reality aren't reality itself, right? And so, like, in this was a concept that I had to talk about when I used to teach spiritual concepts a lot. I would talk about different spiritual ideas. People can get really wrapped up in conceptual ideas of a spiritual experience and think they're having a spiritual experience because they can conceptualize it, but the actual lived experience is something completely different. And like, you can't drink the word water, for example, right? You can describe what's happening in movement, but you aren't going to feel what you're supposed to feel in movement unless, like, I actually, hold on, I actually got a message from someone who's a first time listener. And uh and and one of the said things he said, one of the tough parts about listening about movement is sometimes it's hard to see in my mind's eye. I just want to watch it in action or just leave my work desk and move. It's like, that's exactly it. It's like, we're, even this podcast is talking about movement, but my hope anyway, when we're producing this, is that we're giving you better ideas for you to go implement and experiment and play with yourself. We can try to find the truth behind human biomechanics and movement, but the reality is the actual truth, the real truth, the existential truth of movement happens when you're moving. So, we're talking about biomechanical principles, but you have to go apply it, right? Like, this is, you can spend all the time you want watching people on Instagram and watching the slow mo, and you can do all this shit, but you still have a body, and you aren't just a mind, you aren't just an observer, you have a body yourself. That's the ultimate research tool that you have.
yeah, like a specific example there would be, let's say where Weck was saying you have to get the upper body right, and then the feet kind of fall into place. Like I heard him, like there was an exact quote there, right?
Yeah. We're going to
Um,
cover that with our next episode with him, by the way. That's something that we're going to get more detailed in.
okay, sweet, yeah. Like I'm sure there's a lot of gold there, right? And to some degree it's true, but like are you going to organize your feet if your upper body's organized? Because in my experience, I organized the upper body way before I organized the feet, and it was a problem for me, right? So like in my own lived experience, I went out and tried it, and I did get a lot from the upper body, like learning how to let go of the core and let my spine do its thing.
Mm.
And the head over foot cue obviously was huge for me. um, However, I didn't organize my feet. Like, so my lived experience was that that didn't work, right? So I can take your word for it, and it might work for some people, and it may have just been me, but for me, it wasn't the case. Okay. So you do have to play with these concepts, even stuff that I'm saying, go out and try it yourself. Like, um, you have to play with your body. It really is about having fun and being in your own body and experiencing what it's like to let it flow. Okay. Like a lot of people aren't experiencing this because they're too stuck in a paradigm of, I have to lift an external object that's really heavy. Okay. Which is fun. Like I had so much fun doing it, but it's not actual movement in itself. And it's not exploring so much with your body. There's too many variables. There's too many confines, I should say, not variables, but confines. There's actually less variable. If all
Mm.
I'm doing is picking up a weight, which I would just call like your body just sees an external object. Usually it's a barbell, and barbells are cultural. They're not found in nature. Okay. Um, we learn to love the barbell, and I'm going to go and pick it up off the ground. That is a very confined uh, situation there, right? That's not really exploring your body. That is organizing your body to do a certain task. If you're like, let's say, an Olympic lifter and you're really good at it, there's a lot of organization there, but it's the same task that you have to do, the same organization that you have to do over and over again. The transfer, the variability isn't really there in real life. And again, that's like, we go back to the science on this one. It's like, we're looking for the most power output from the muscles. And this actually will relate back to balance. Just give me 1 second with this one, right? So we need to, in order to get more power, obviously we need to fire the most muscle fibers. And to fire the most muscle fibers, the most fast twitch fibers, what should I do? I should lift a weight, because with 400 pounds on my back, you should see my fast twitch fibers fire. They're all over the place. If you put an ECG on my glutes, let's say, it would spike. The activity would spike. And so you'd be like, okay, that right there is the exercise, because that will get you the most power. It's firing the most fibers, which may be true. But let's move it back to balance. If I'm boxing, let's say, okay, take the SAID principle, very specifically adapted. So let's say I'm trying to be good at boxing, okay? I start to do heavy squats. And to squat, let's say 400 pounds, okay? That'll take me, let's say I do it super quick, 400 pound single rep, or let's say 500 pounds. I'm very strong. That single rep will take me 1.5 to 2 seconds of applying force through the ground. In order to get that, how do I say this? Like, basically, to get that weight up, I have to take 2 seconds, and that is specifically pushing force through the ground for 2 seconds. However, in boxing, I need to be able to push through the ground in 0.0001 second, because I want to move to my next move and I want to be in the right spot. So am I going to be able to now transfer getting all those fibers to fire at once in that 0.1 second? Or am I not going to be able to do it now because I didn't specifically adapt to that? Right? So...
And I was even having a conversation with someone recently asked, like, hey, I know you've been training in Goda for quite a while. What do you do for your upper body? And I was explaining, it's like, when I started, like, I can't do any of the typical upper body stuff that I'd normally been able to do because of the shoulder rehab recovery. And I have a lot more function in it now, and I can almost hang from a bar. And I was thinking, it's like, maybe I'll do pull-ups. But basically what I've been doing is I've been taking a cable machine and I've been trying to do pulling movements and pushing movements and throwing biomechanical movements with a cable machine that emulate the sort of biomechanical chain of what would happen either in a sprint, in a jog. So I would do the side bend with the row, and I would side bend the other way, and I would get some rotation happening at my shoulder joint, and I would try to emulate the same biomechanics of what would happen at my scapula. And I was doing all this stuff, and I thought about it, and I was like, my goals are to be a more efficient runner and sprinter right now. Like, that's my ultimate goals. I'm trying to improve the efficiency of my gait, my cutting, and just like my movement in general. And what I'm doing right now is I'm kind of these are biomechanically, quote, correct patterns, but what I'm doing is I'm sequencing them with muscular contraction, and I'm not training the elastic component. So I was saying, one of the things that happen when I'm sprinting is I'll drive my elbow back, and that stretch in my pecs and my shoulder will help me recoil in a spiral forward in that bend. And I'm getting more power from the elastic movement as I'm lifting weights, as I'm doing specific resistance training. I'm not training that elastic quality, and I'm overemphasizing the musculature, and I'm almost training my nervous system for muscular contraction in a specific way that wouldn't show up in a sprint. Right? Like, I'm not like my sprint would not, like, I don't know if I would actually benefit from having the pure muscular contractile action that happens in the pec when I'm doing a forward cable fly, even if I'm doing it with a step forward and with the rotation and with the proper thing. I'm training a muscular contraction, not an elastic recoil. And that was the thing where it's like, okay, I want to go back to the drawing board, and I want to see if there's a way that I can produce a training effect that creates an elastic quality in these areas, and doesn't just emulate the biomechanical pattern, but also sort of the elastic quality that's happening in the movement.
It's a very interesting point that you brought up, right? Like, how much can you train the movement outside of the movement itself, right? That's the $1 million question. Like, let's say FP, for instance, training multiple slings at once, or training multiple chains of myofascia, right? And using, let's say, a cable machine or a cable bar, and having those muscles connect I think that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to connect the muscles, make them fire together. How much of that can you do before you actually transfer it into actual movement, right? Like at some point, if you want to train movement, you have to do movements themselves. And then that becomes the training as well, as long as you're doing it correctly, right? Like getting reps in without cable machines, without weights, without anything else. It's just you and your body doing it very efficiently, biomechanically correct, with whatever movement you're doing, and not just relying on the the cable machines, the even drop-ins or something like that, which I do all the time, right? Like I'm definitely not shitting on drop-ins because I love them, right? But what I'm saying is eventually you have to take a drop-in and put it into a movement, right? Like transfer that type of motion and transfer those forces into an actual movement if you want to get better at movement.
Yeah, and that was like ultimately I'm like, okay, I can train the fractal elements of these patterns, but I think what I ultimately ended up doing is I just spent more time sprinting. And I spent more time, it's like, okay, like I do 10-second intervals at an 80% effort, where it's just enough to stretch my mind, and I would focus on one element at a time. Like it's like, okay, I've done enough drilling on my feet that my feet are kind of, they're not, the ankles aren't collapsing. I'm still floating my heels. Things are going good. I'm gonna see how efficient with that upper body whip I can get now as I'm transferring energy from side to side. How much can I get that elastic recoil on my shoulders? And it was a wonderful thing. You get a full body workout when you're sprinting, and when you think about these things, like it is a lot of power output. Your muscles are still contracting, but it's not the idea that you are consciously contracting a muscle as if you were bodybuilding. You're not specifically trying to isolate a muscle group. You're just your muscles are contracting as a result of the biomechanical forces that are being input onto it, and that ends up being more functional because you're working the entire system as a system. And that for me, it was like, okay, what does a workout look like for me now that I'm prioritizing movement? Because my brain still wants to go, man, load up a heavy bar on a landmine and do super super heavy drop-ins and get your fucking drop into like you can do 200-pound drop-ins and get super super jacked and like do these little pulses that are super heavy. And it's like, man, do I need that? Do I really need that?
It's very interesting. I'm almost going to contradict myself, my last statement, because it reminds me of what Bam said. Go to Bam in our last or 3 podcasts ago, I guess you can say.
Mhm.
Basically, it's what you need. Okay. If you need to recode, let's just use that word. If there's certain parts that don't act in the symphony, that don't play well together, you do need to isolate those parts and figure out how they move. But again, at a certain point, you should probably integrate them into an actual movement. Okay. So I'm not saying that for everybody doing isolated movements isn't valuable, because actually at the start, almost everybody needs to isolate, with not like a bodybuilder, but more of like GOTA style or like WEC or FP, where you're using the whole body. Okay. You have to isolate certain parts and then reintegrate them into the whole system. Okay. And at first, you may need to quote unquote recode certain parts. Let's say your ankle drops way too much. Even like, I'd say WEC and Nodi and GOTA would say that having an extreme drop on your ankle bone isn't a great thing, right? Like if it's touching the floor, not a good thing, right? So I think all of them would agree. And even, scientific minded people would be like, okay, we got to get something has to be done about this. They might go about it a different way, but something must be done in order for you to have good mechanics throughout the chain, right? So it really depends on where you're at. But if once you're past the point of, you understand how, let's say for me, the ankle, I understood how to like climb it, and I understood how to feel it in step. So I go and I step and I do 10,000 of them, and I do them barefoot, let's say, right? And I really integrate it into the body that way. Not so much just hitting 100,000 reps in the gym and never bringing it to an actual motion, right? So always remember, if you can bring it to an actual motion, try to make it play in the symphony of the other parts of your body to act as a whole.
Yeah, and I think think one of the benefits of having biomechanical north stars, like, defining your true north in terms of biomechanically efficient patterns, the way that Goda has, I love their universal principles of movement, like back chain dominance. Like, these are all things that don't just happen in movement, in a training capacity or in an athletic capacity. These are things that you can think about throughout your day. And the paradigm shift that both you and I have really embraced, I think, is the idea that movement isn't just the hour that you spend training. It's your entire life. Everything that you like. This whole podcast, I'm sure if you've watched the replay on No Filter, you watched it live, you've been seeing me switch from a Seiza position, and you going from leg to leg on a cowboy position. But I'm on the floor and I'm doing a lot of movement, because this is, first of all, I'm moving and I don't have a single chair left in my house. But second of all, doing this stuff on the ground anyway, this is my movement practice applied to my life. Like, the fact that I can be on the floor comfortably for 75 minutes and not feel like my back is dying, not feel like my knees are going to pop out, not feeling like my hips are exploding. This is the fruits of my movement practice that I do throughout the day. This is just the principles of how I believe that I should be living in my body, not necessarily just the hour that I'm training. So on that note, guys, we're going to wrap up today's episode. We have an amazing month coming up. We have some really cool guests. Even next Saturday at 9 p.m. Eastern time, we're going to have Gary Scheffler and Ricky Stanzi of the GLS performance team, as well as Eric Tessie, Go to Coach, who we interviewed a little while back on our podcast. They're going to come on and do a bit of almost a response style episode to the last episode that we had with David Weck. We're going to be getting some amazing guests. I think
is that this Saturday or next Saturday?
That is this Saturday. So
this Saturday.
in 2 days, yeah, is going to be that particular episode. So you'll want to join us for the live on that, because we're going to be pulling up a lot of slow motion video. And we got a ton of other amazing guests lined up. We'll save some surprises for you, but come join us next Saturday for that amazing conversation that's going to happen with some of the head Go to coaches. And we'll catch you next time, guys. Thank you again for listening to the Art of Move podcast. We're looking forward to another amazing month with some amazing guests and some crazy conversations about biomechanics.
Have a good one, guys. Let movement be your medicine.